All right. Welcome, Matt. How are you?
Good, good. How are you this morning?
All right, man. It's good to see you. And well, it's been a busy week since we last connected uh, to discuss current events over the last 2 weeks. Can you imagine? Things have been persistent, and of course, I'm referring to the uh, response, political agitation, political activism, demonstration, protest, repression, unfortunately, uh, all tied to the most recently visibilized, the most recently exposed, the most recently illuminated uh, lynching, public lynching. In this case, the lynching of Mr. George Floyd. So it's been quite a, what has it been, 2 weeks or a week and a half?
I think it's been been 2 weeks.
Wow. Well, before we begin discussion today, particularly as far as
May 25th.
chapter 4, pardon?
So it was May 25th. So it's been about He was killed on May 25th. George Floyd.
That's
He was murdered on May 25th. So
wow.
Yeah,
Well, 2 weeks.
Days, so
2 weeks of indignation and 2 weeks of dignified rage. Seems odd to ask, but I do want to know how you're doing.
I've obviously it's these things are very upsetting, and I mean obviously they're it's something that happens all the time, but it's also something that that particular incident was so visually horrific. It was so visually horrible, and there's a reason why certain sparks light the flame. I mean, when something is just that bad, that the murder, the public murder of Eric Garner, obviously the public murder now of George Floyd, Mike Brown when they left his body there for hours. I mean, there's certain insult upon injury, or there's certain things that obviously are death is horrible. I mean, death is like the worst thing that can happen, right? Killing someone is the worst thing you can do to them. But sometimes the murder is so grotesque that it's so awful, and it's so transparently awful that it sparks a response. And I think that having seen that, it was terrible. But having seen the response, I mean, having seen what people do and how they have engaged, and knowing the historic timeline this kind of belongs to, it's pretty historic moment. So it's
we participated in the caravan, the Unión del Barrio Caravan yesterday, and it was I don't want to frame it as I don't want to frame it as a celebration, because of course it wasn't a celebration, but it certainly was uplifting, and uplifting in the political sense, I suppose, uplifting and catapulting. Maybe catapulting is the appropriate word. It certainly was catapulting, and invigorating to see folks participate. As I understand, the caravan was 10 miles long. It took us 4 hours. It took us 4 hours to get from the funeral site of Mr. Bunchy Carter all the way to the downtown police station. So it was a very catapulting, as I said, moment. And it's in that spirit that I bring our discussion to chapter 4. As far as I have the book here on the side here. As far as page 163 in my book, as far as part 2, the transformation of money into capital. Chapter 4, the general formula of capital. And it's in that context, before we get into the theoretical discussion, the subject of the commodity money circuit and the commodity money commodity circuit, I do want to shed light on something. Folks were participating in a variety of protests and manifestations yesterday throughout the nation. In fact, internationally, not just nationally, but internationally, in places like Brazil, Mexico, England. I understand that there was also violent or repressive acts on the part of the French state in Paris, I believe it was. Of course, these are some of the societies internationally that have a marked history of a state repression and a repression by use of its prison industrial complex. It's police, it's military. So I'd like to shed light on a couple things so that we can begin to talk about the commodification, the commodification of the economy, and really what I want to get at is the commoditization or the commodification, not just of immigrant people, right, or people who are perceived to be and treated to be, and who may themselves perceive themselves to be immigrants, however misrecognized, understandings about their indigeneity is in America, however ignored those understandings are, but also, of course, the pattern of imprisonment and surveillance and torture and death of Black people in the American continent. And so I want to, I was thinking about how to address this. Our work is theoretical, as practically informed as it is, and as we pursue practical applications, drawn from the work of Marx. Our work is here, at least within the scope of the time that we have together on this program, Matt. Our work is theoretical, right? And so, being that it is theoretical, I'd like to shed light on something to make this notion of commodity or commoditization relevant and substantive to people. And I'd like to talk about ankle bracelets. I'd like to talk about ankle bracelets as a technology, a system, an extension of the prison industrial complex. I'd like to talk about the ways in which it effectively makes the imprisoned their own guards. I'm not in favor, I'm not using this time, and certainly I'm personally not in favor of the existence of repressive surveillance on Black and brown bodies repressive state-sponsored or corporate-sponsored or corporate mechanized systems of repression. But it's interesting to note that now, even by way of the ankle bracelets, guards, the prison guard system, the policing of Black and brown people is, as being turned in on the very people themselves. They guard themselves. I've had contact with people who have been quote unquote monitored, a euphemism if there ever has been one. People who have been shackled in this particular way are constantly in fear that this particular device is going, the batteries of this particular device, that the batteries are going to be dead, that they're going to be caught wherever it is that they might be, without emitting a signal to whatever industry is tracking them. And then, of course, they will be rounded up, caught. I'd like to begin by asking you about this. What do you think? Your comments?
On ankle brace? I think there's something like 2.2. I know that the number kind of flatlined, and so it's like it hovers between 2 and 2.5 million people in prison. Just in the prison industrial complex. But when you actually look at the number of people that are under house arrest, or under or on probation, that number skyrockets, right? So there are so many people that are in one level or another, being essentially having their movement kind of monitored or limited, or essentially imprisoned, right? Whether they're actually in the facility or outside of it. So that number has expanded so greatly since the mid 1970s. The actual number that we tend to look at is the number of people that are actually physically incarcerated in a prison, right? Yeah. But when you actually add in all the people who are at one stage or another involved with, just not free, it's not completely free after report to a probation officer or under house arrest, that number skyrockets, right? So in that, you see a general trend of all things that will quote unquote be a public service, because believe it or not, your own incarceration is a part of the public service, right? As a part of the public, this is something the public typically pays for. We see all sectors of what we could kind of refer to as public life being privatized. So if you look at the amount of ankle bracelets, well, the question in my mind, I don't have the answer here because I wasn't talk about ankle bracelets, but sorry about that. It's okay. But I'm sure just a little bit of research would show that there's probably a lot of private corporations that are in the ankle.
Yes, there are,
and I'm sure that they have grown their profit margin quite a bit in the past, probably decade or so. At the same time, the private prison thing has exploded, right around that kind of like 2009-ish kind of period where 2009, 2010, 2012, where the private prisons really started expanding to where they made up, I don't know what they make up now. I think something almost like 10% of the growth, or a lot of the growth has been in the private.
As I was getting ready for today's talk, and I just did a Google search, right? I typed in ankle bracelets, and then instead of articles were coming up, and I was I saw that many of these articles, instead of using the word ankle bracelet, or instead of using the term ankle shackle, right? Because really that's what they are. Use the word monitor, and I thought, well, that's a euphemism if there ever has been one. Thinking about the shackling of human beings by way of these devices, this technology, this contemporary digital device. Of course, I learned, that surprise of all surprise, quote unquote. Of course, I'm saying this very sarcastically and very cynically. The GEO Group, which many of us know has a although I think they might have changed their name recently, or I might be getting them confused with the CCA, or Correctional Corporation of America. I think they also are the ones that, they might be the ones that changed their name. But in any case, what I learned was that at the tail end of, or rather, I'm sorry, at the beginning of George Bush II, at the beginning of his second presidential administration, and leading up to the most recent presidential administration, the GEO Group, and one of its subsidiaries, the BI Group, right, was receiving approximately $14 million, received approximately $14 million for its work in the detention, in this case, of immigrant people, right? And the quantity of money skyrockets, more than 10 times under the Trump administration. In this case, currently the GEO Group is receiving from the federal government $183 million, right, to imprison and detain and otherwise detain and otherwise shackle immigrant people. So I don't mean to look at this matter exclusively, but I use this as a point of departure to get folks who are interested in the general area, the general experiences of Chicana and Chicano people, to think about how it is that our relatives, or that our neighbors, or that our communities more generally, right, are being commoditized in a way that is akin, not the same, of course, but in a way that is akin to the practices of shackling African people in America. And I'd like to get folks to begin to think about the parallels here, so that we can then turn to some theoretical understanding. We can talk about, the commoditization of products and the commoditization of human beings in a capitalist economy. I'll stop just in case you have some. I'll stop in case you have some comment or would like to mention something. By the way, thank you, Daryl Wasteland Mitchell, for joining us. And as always, thank you so much, Karina, for joining us. Go ahead.
I mean, at the core of the, quote unquote American experience, I mean, throughout both, North America and South America to, to the whole Western Hemisphere, I mean, at the core of the last 500 years has been this question of stolen lives and stolen land, right? It's the idea of, the transatlantic slave trade and the conquest of the Americas. And every kind of, every iteration of anything it does is rooted in those two things. I mean, there's nothing outside of that. That nothing happens in any part of the Western Hemisphere that is not somehow directly correlated to those two phenomena, right? There's just every economic thing, every movement, every everything that happens that way. And so whether you point out a misrecognition of indigeneity or this or that, I mean, what we're talking about here is stolen land. It's people being. I mean, if you look at the people that are at the bottom of every economic ladder, if you look at the people who are the most oppressed, if you look at the people who, when I say oppressed, what I mean by that, I mean terrorized by the state, subject of state terror, right? You look at people who are subject to the greatest level of state terror. If you look to the people who are suffering the greatest rates of exploitation, right? Because it's very important to understand that when we talk about exploitation, we're talking about the fact that you are paid less than you produce, right? So if you're paid a dime less than you produce, you're being exploited in the capitalist sense of the word. Well, now we're talking about rates of exploitation, right? And so the rates of exploitation, if you look at what Marx was writing about in England, right? So the labor was being exploited in Manchester, right? But the rate of exploitation in the colonies was always far, far higher, right? So the rate of exploitation that is subject to Black and brown people, who are subject to the people who have ancestry and physical phenotypes that date back to the original peoples of this land, right? Those people, right? Me, you, all kinds of other people, whether we call ourselves Latinos or whether we call ourselves American Indian or whatever we call ourselves, whether we know the tribal name that dates back, to time immemorial, whatever, we are subject to a rate of exploitation and to a criminalization that is rooted in that history, right? So that's that. The other history, the other parallel history, the other parallel crime would be the transatlantic slave trade. The removal of people from Africa, brought here, enslaved, in shackles, forced to live their entire lives out a certain kind of way, and then from there on to Jim Crow, and in the case of the United States, from there on to Jim Crow, and then so on and so forth, right? And so that's the kind of thing that we look at these two parallel things that we can explain why we see these similarities. And there are different, obviously there are different like points of departure between the two communities, that happen. Things play out differently given certain historical trajectories, right? But there's a reason why we find the harshest, the cruelest, the most incredible forms of exploitation and oppression experienced by what we refer to as Black and brown people here in the Americas. And so I think that is kind of that kind of explains that. But as far as like the expansion we were talking about earlier of these private prisons and these private these private things, that has something